So, you have a comic book for me?
Yes, sir, I do. I was thinking about how you were telling me how well Justice League was selling for DC Comics, and I figured we could do some superhero comics too.
Right, because the other books you're selling, like Nellie the Nurse, aren't selling at all?
Hey, I need you to get all the way off my back.
Whoa, I'm off it all the way there, true believer. So, what's your superhero idea?
Well, I was thinking that since Jack Kirby's book Challengers of the Unknown was selling well, he could do that here, but call it Fantastic Four. He's already made some logo ideas.
Oh, logos are tight. So, what's the story?
Well, I basically told Jack to draw whatever he likes, and then I'll add some dialogue to it.
Oh, so Jack is drawing and writing the book?
No, I'm adding the dialogue, so I'll be credited as writer.
I'm not sure that's how that works.
Hey, shut up! So I'm calling it the Marvel Method.
Sorry, Ryan George. Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. When comic books first came out, they were designed to be fast and cheap, and to that end, they followed the assembly line process that Henry Ford had popularized with the Model T car. In other words, they had tasks broken up and delegated: writer, penciler, inker, colorist, letterer, editor, and so on. And yeah, sometimes some of those tasks overlapped. But when Marvel Comics debuted their superhero line, starting with Fantastic Four #1 in the fall of 1961, editor and writer Stan Lee started using a slightly different process that came to be known as the Marvel Method. I'll let Stan explain that in his own words.
There is something called the Marvel Method of writing comics, which is really the Stan Lee method. What happened was they had always been written scripted, the way a motion picture has a screenplay. And I used to write them that way. I'd write the script, give it to the artist, and he would draw it. But by the time we were doing Spider-Man and the Hulk and the Fantastic Four and Iron Man and Daredevil and Thor, I didn't even mention the X-Men and the X-Men. I couldn't write them fast enough. And these artists were so brilliant, and they were so good at story themselves, that I would say to the artist, look, this is the plot I want. And I would either tell them in a few words what the story was, or I would write an outline on a page or 2 pages or a few paragraphs. And I'd say, you go ahead and draw it any way you want. It doesn't matter. I'll put the words in and tie it all together. And they did that. And it worked out beautifully because the artist wasn't handicapped by or inhibited by my descriptions. The artist could tell the story visually any way he wanted. And once I got the pages back and I was looking at the drawings, it was so easy for me to pinpoint the dialogue and make it exactly fit the expression on the character's face and so forth. And I loved working that way. And I was the guy who put in all the sound effects. I would letter them in. And I had a way of working. If the illustration was... See, a writer has a lot of freedom. If the illustration was very beautiful, I put very little or no dialogue in because I wanted the illustration to show. If we had an area where you had a few panels that not much was going on and they weren't that interesting, I'd put in as much dialogue as I could and sound effects, and I spaced. See, I laid out the balloons too. I would put the balloons in such a way that they seemed to be part of the design and they made the panel look more interesting than it was. So working that way, it became known as the Marvel Method.
Today, I want to talk about what the artists who used the Marvel Method thought about it. And it isn't a discussion of who created which character, even though that discussion overlaps. Instead, I just want to look at the different opinions, because some artists, like John Romita, John Buscema, they have said that they quite liked it. And others, like Wallace Wood, Steve Ditko, Jack Kirby, They ended up being so annoyed by it that they actually quit. So there's a lot of different opinions. Let's all jump together to the Silver Age of comics. Marvel superheroes. Marvel Comics was a small operation when they began launching their superhero titles in the early 1960s. Stan Lee was the editor, and the freelance artists who got regular work included Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, Don Heck, and Dick Ayers. There were a few things done by guys like Bill Everett and Wallace Wood, who had been in the industry for a while by then. But guys like John Romita and John Buscema wouldn't start working until 1965 and 1966, respectively. Let's see what each of them had to say. Dick Ayers was best known as one of Jack Kirby's inkers, beginning to collaborate with him at Marvel with 1959's Journey into Mystery issue 57. He also took over penciling Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos with issue 8 in 1964, and being the main artist through issue 120 10 years later. According to writer Barry Pearls, Dick Ayers told him he liked the freedom of the Marvel method because, quote, it would allow him to properly pace the story and not be glued to what a writer had written, end quote. However, it is worth noting that in the Dick Ayers story, an autobiography by Ayers made in 2005, he shares this comic about working with the Marvel method, saying to his wife, "It's great to be penciling again," and telling the story from Stan's synopsis. He just dictates to me over the telephone, and I immediately write the page sequence I'm going to tell his story in the number of pages he tells me. It feels like I'm co-writing the story. I'm drawing the art with margin notes to show him where my drawings are in his plot. And you're not paid. I think I'm learning to write. You should be paid. You ask him. Stan, I think I should be paid for co-writing your stories. You don't even give me credit. You just sign your name as writer.
My oh my, you do have an ego. Okay, I'll add a couple of bucks to your page rate, but not your name as a writer.
Based on this short story, I take it that Dick Ayers felt that he was owed at least some money co-writing the stories that he was drawing. But not every artist was necessarily so secure in their position that they were comfortable rocking the boat. Don Heck is best known for a lengthy run drawing the Avengers, as well as co-creating characters like Iron Man, Hawkeye, Black Widow, the Wasp, and many more. Even if the fans preferred guys like Jack Kirby, he had the respect of his fellow professionals, and his work stands the test of time in my opinion. It's clean, it's dramatic, it's what you want for superhero comics. Heck was asked about drawing a comic from a plot in a 1982 interview in Comics Feature issue 21. Heck explained what happened when Stan Lee gave him a brief synopsis saying, "I said you're crazy." He said, "Don't worry, you can do it." I took Lee's plots over the phone, tape recording them for later playback. I would put the whole thing together with all the pictures and send it in. When I got it back and I read it, I said, "Gee, it works fine. It's great." However, Stan Lee, in his role as editor, would sometimes ask artists to change things after they turned in their pages, redraw something. According to John Buscema, it happened to him, and when he told the story about it happening to him, he in turn spoke about how Don Heck dealt with having to redraw stuff because of the Marvel method. Buscema told the story at the 2001 San Diego Comic-Con in a panel featuring Marvel bullpen artists. Buscema's story started when he discussed his famous issue of Silver Surfer, saying, quote, "Silver Surfer number 4. Oh, you heard that story? You want to hear about that? If I tell you, it does not leave this room. Now number 4, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was one of the best jobs I'd ever done. Well, I went into Stan's office and he tore the book apart. I mean, it was an absolute disaster as far as he was concerned. He tore page after page after page and said, 'You shouldn't have done this,' and 'You shouldn't have done that.' I walked out of the office cross-eyed. I walked into John Romita's office and said, 'John, how do you do comics?' I'm going to tell you something. A situation like that killed Don Heck's career. He was demoralized because editors were on his back. He'd come to me practically in tears and ask me, 'John, what can I do to satisfy these guys?' And Don was a talented guy, who's so great. It destroyed some people, but it didn't destroy me. I said, if I can't work with Stan, I'll go somewhere else. To hell with Stan." A sad story for Don. The poor guy died. Seriously now, I don't want to be melodramatic, but the man died of a broken heart. If a book didn't sell, it was never the writer's fault. It was always the artist's fault. The writer is always right. The artist is the one who fell on his face. Am I right? Buscema is being pretty dramatic. Don Heck sadly died of lung cancer, not a broken heart. But it's true that he was demoralized by having to redraw a bunch of stuff. Superheroes weren't really his wheelhouse, even though he was good at it. If you want to see Don Heck at his best, go back to a lot of his 1950s work on war, on horror. Just great stuff. Really, really shows how good Don Heck could be. But the industry at the time wanted superheroes, and Stan Lee specifically wanted his artists to draw as much like Jack Kirby as possible. Stan Lee was a big fan of Jack Kirby, and in the early years of their collaborations, Stan was much more gracious about how much work Jack did in conceiving their stories. In a 1968 interview in the fanzine Castle of Frankenstein, Stan Lee explained the Marvel method and then elaborated, saying, quote, "Some artists, of course, need a more detailed plot than others. Some artists, such as Jack Kirby, need no plot at all. I mean, I'll just say to Jack, let's let the next villain be Doctor Doom. Or I may not even say that. He may tell me. And then he goes home and he does it. He's so good at plots. I'm sure he's 1,000 times better than I. He just about makes up the plots for these stories. All I do is a little editing." Wow. Stan sure seems to have let it slip that Jack Kirby was coming up with the stories. Stan may not have even given him a plot sometimes. Stan sure didn't say things like that after the 1960s. But what did Jack Kirby have to say about this method of writing? Jack Kirby's work speaks for itself. From co-creating Captain America back in the 1940s to basically co-creating most of Marvel's 1960s superheroes, to then continuing to create characters at DC in the 1970s like the New Gods and the Demon, this is just a small mention of the many comics he created. And Jack was pretty clear on how he perceives his history at Marvel. In a 1990 interview with Gary Groth, also featuring Jack's wife Roz, they discussed his work, including using the Marvel method. Hello, and welcome to Comic Tropes Theater. Tonight, myself and the Comic Tropes players will be performing an excerpt from a 1990 interview with Jack and Roz Kirby, performed by Gary Groth of Fantagraphics. I will be playing the role of Gary Groth, and with me, I have Comic Drake essaying the role of Jack Kirby, and Linkara performing the role of Roz Kirby, although I have told him that he is performing the role of Jack Kirby. Let's begin. Can you explain how it worked? I think according to Stan, he would give you a plot, you would draw it, and he would write it. Now, would you dispute...
Stan would say that he needs the story, and I think they'd talk 2 minutes on the phone, and then Jack would go off and write the story on the side of the art.
Stan didn't know what the heck the stories were about.
I've seen original art with words written on the sides of the pages.
That would be my dialogue.
You would talk to Stan on the phone. What was a typical conversation like when you were plotting the Fantastic Four? What would he say, and what would you say?
On the Fantastic Four, I'd tell him what I was going to do, what the story was going to be, and I'd bring it in. That's all.
Stan Lee would always say, "Great."
And that's all Stan Lee would say. Great.
Did he ever have criticisms of your storylines? Would he ever say, I think you should go in a different direction or anything like that?
No. He took them verbatim. If Stan Lee had ever done that, I'd be over in DC in about 5 minutes.
Wait a second. These are Roz Kirby's lines.
Comic Tropes Prank.
Comic Tropes Prank.
I really don't think there's anything more that needs to be said. Jack Kirby was always clear about saying he created the stories, the names, and left notes in the margins to guide the dialogue phase. A lot of the surviving original artwork has sadly been cropped, so we've lost a lot of Kirby's notes. But in the cases where we do have the full artboard from, say, auctions or fans making sure to preserve that, there are a lot of examples of descriptions of the plot, extensive direction on what the characters were saying. Kirby's history with Marvel in 1968 through 1970 is pretty complex. For instance, Kirby sided with Marvel in a case where Joe Simon was trying to trademark Captain America. And then at the same time, Mark Evanier, a comic book historian, a biographer of a lot of greats, and also a former production assistant of Jack Kirby, said that Kirby left Marvel in 1970 because they offered him a new contract and then they wouldn't negotiate on it at all. And they would argue that Stan Lee was the creator of all of these characters. And I have to wonder, did Marvel do that because Stan was an employee and Jack was technically a freelancer and they were protecting their rights to these characters? I think that's definitely possible. Either way, Jack did leave, and that brings us to a similar situation with a talented artist, Wallace "Wally" Wood. Wallace Wood, often credited as Wally Wood, had become a big name in comics thanks to his work at EC Comics in the 1950s. He began working at Marvel when his friend Joe Orlando stepped down from Daredevil, having said he didn't care for working in the Marvel method. Wood redesigned Daredevil's outfit into the now iconic all-red one, and drew some beautiful work. But he also stuck up for himself when he felt he was really doing most of the writing by using the Marvel method. In an interview with Mark Evanier, found in The Life and Legend of Wallace Wood, Volume 1, Wood explains what happened. "I enjoyed working with Stan on Daredevil, but for one thing, I had to make up the whole story. He was being paid for writing, and I was being paid for drawing, but he didn't have any ideas. I'd go in for a plotting session, and we'd just stare at each other until I came up with a storyline. I felt that I was writing the book, but not being paid for writing." You did write one issue, as I recall. "One, yes. I persuaded him to let me write one by myself, since I was doing 99% of the writing already. I wrote it, handed it in, and he said it was hopeless. He said he'd have to rewrite it all and write the next issue himself. Well, I said I couldn't contribute to the storyline unless I got paid something for writing, and Stan said he'd look into it, but after that, he only had inking for me. Bob Powell was suddenly penciling Daredevil. I complained about not being paid for writing, and suddenly I was inking Powell. But I managed to talk him into letting me write one." So now let's talk about Steve Ditko. Steve Ditko had started working at Marvel back when they were called Atlas in the 1950s, working on various horror stories, monster books, sci-fi, stuff like that. And of course he made a big name for himself, co-creating characters like Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. But this isn't to talk about who created what, it's to talk about what the artists thought of the Marvel method. Now with Steve Ditko, it's a little trickier because barring a very few small exceptions, he didn't do interviews, he didn't do conventions. What he did do, though, was answer fan letters and write essays in the back of his self-published comics. In Ditko's book, The Avenging World, he includes a description of his initial working arrangement with Stan Lee, writing, quote, "Briefly, in regards to our working method, Stan provided the plot ideas. There would be a discussion to clear up anything, consider options, and so forth. I would then do the panel page breakdowns, pencil the visual story continuity, and, on a separate piece of paper, provide a very rough panel dialogue, merely as a guide for Stan." Ditko argued that by only providing a synopsis instead of a script, the writer surrendered his division of labor to the artist, and he termed his role the Artist Plus. Ditko began rejecting Stan's plot synopses according to letters he wrote to David Kirby that were included in his biography. He wrote to David, quote, "Stan was willing to go along with my not using his usual monthly plots, like having Spider-Man battle Atuma or introduce a Spider-Girl, a purely monthly episode." Ditko felt he deserved more credit, and issue 17 of The Amazing Spider-Man features this note in the letters page from Stan Lee. "And as for old Spidey, next ish is gonna be real different. The whole plot was dreamed up by Sonny Steve, and it was just nutty enough for Stan to okay it. You'll see Spidey acting differently than ever before. 'Nuff said." Ditko's further essays detail that his working relationship with Stan began to fall apart once he got plotting credit, and by issue 25, they were no longer speaking face to face. Ditko recounts this time in his essay, Why I Quit Spider-Man Marvel. He explains production manager Saul Brodsky called him to remind him that Marvel needed a story for an upcoming Spider-Man annual. Playing the role of Steve Ditko and reading part of his essay is professional actor Tony Wolff.
Later, thinking about what I could do for the annual, I asked myself, why should I do it? Why should I continue to do all these monthly issues, original story ideas, material for a man who is too scared, too angry over something to even see or talk to me? I decided to quit Marvel, Spider-Man, Doctor Strange. So my next visit to Marvel, I told Saul I was quitting Marvel.
The breakdown of the communication between Stan Lee and Steve Ditko is kind of tragic in hindsight. They had a good thing going, but Stan was also a little bit dismissive of Steve's contributions. If you look at the letters pages at that era, he'd always be like, yo, if you don't get it, blame Steve. It was kind of a weird way to phrase things at the end of reading a full comic book. Anyway, Steve Ditko was a very complex man. He had strong philosophical ideas based on Ayn Rand's philosophies. He believed basically in doing the exact amount of work that you were being compensated for and no more. He believed in moral absolutes. There was black, there was white, there was no gray in between. That said, he did ultimately end up coming back to Marvel in his later years to do some freelance work. He just wouldn't work on Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. Once Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby left Marvel, the big artists became John Buscema, Gil Kane, and John Romita. And they were all pretty loyal company men that said they enjoyed using the Marvel method. For instance, Comic Book Workshop Showcase interviewed John Buscema, and he shared how he liked the process when asked what he considered his best piece of work to be. Buscema replied, quote, I would have to say the Silver Surfer stories my brother Sal and I worked on. I had a lot of freedom on that job. I had a very sketchy plot outline to work from, which I prefer, and I just felt good doing it. The Kirby estate sued Marvel, and in 2010, John Romita was deposed, asked to speak about the process stories were created in. On the record, Romita talked about how Stan Lee wouldn't use notes from artists found in the margins, saying, quote, he invariably did not use anything that was in the margins that was cleverly suggested by the artists, because he said he did not want to stray from his normal approach, end quote. Interestingly, Stan Lee was also deposed in that court case and asked about what he did at Marvel. Stan explained how he was paid, saying, quote, I received a salary which paid me as editor and art director, but I also got paid on a freelance basis for the stories that I wrote. And according to Mark Evanier, back in the day, Marvel kept no official accounting records, so the printed credits was how they kept track of paying freelancers. Evanier told the Jack Kirby fan group on Facebook, quote, Marvel kept no records of this stuff. In fact, every time there's a reprint fee due on Fantastic Four Annual Number 5, inked by Jacoya, but credited to Synot, they pay Synot. There is the insidious idea that Stan Lee could have been giving himself a full writer credit as a way to get paid more. I'm not fully prepared to dive into whether that's so or not. Because right now I've been focusing on interviews from the artists using the Marvel method. And I think what we can learn from that is that it was pretty much split half and half. People liked using the Marvel method. People really didn't think it was fair. I think that there were guys that sometimes it was easier to stand up and advocate for themselves. Guys like Steve Ditko and Wallace Wood, they didn't have children to support. So if they wanted to leave, they could leave. They were men of great character. Whereas there were other guys like John Romita or Jack Kirby that had families to support, you know? And yeah, Jack Kirby did leave Marvel, but he was there for a long time. And I think Jack Kirby knew the business as well as anybody at that point. He may not have always felt that the deal he was getting was fair, but he would ping pong between Marvel and DC based on who was giving him the best deal in that moment. Some really interesting interviews. I think the Marvel method has by and large faded away at this point. I think these days it's much more likely for a credited writer to have written a full script. Now, every collaboration is different in comics, so the amount of detail that writer may be providing for each page and panel can definitely vary. But I think these days it would be much more common for a writer to provide a full script, whether at Marvel or any other publisher. But it is interesting, you know, it makes me think about the different ways there are to collaborate in comics, and I'm curious, you know, what do you guys think? Do you think that a synopsis puts too much pressure on an artist to create the whole story? Or do you think that that freedom is something that brings out their best work? I'd be very curious to hear your opinion in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll be back real soon. I've got some more stuff to say over the closing credits of this episode, but until I see you next time, just remember, keep reading comics. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching this episode. It was a lot of fun to make, but it also took a lot of time, obviously. So thank you for your patience. In fact, as long as I'm doing thanks, I've got a bunch of people to thank this time. First of all, I don't know if it should be an apology or a thank you, but thank you to Ryan George for the inspiration for the opening gag. I won't do that again, I promise. Thank you to a bunch of the people that helped out in this episode. Comic Drake and Linkara, both willing to step up and play a very small role. I appreciate it. It added some visual interest. Please check out their channels below if you want more comic book content. So I've got the links in the description below. Thank you also to Tony Wolf. Tony Wolf. You may have actually seen him acting, folks. He played Steve Ditko in my episode. He's also got a great autobiographical comic he made, Tales from the Wolf. And if you watched the Super Bowl this past year, you would have seen him in that CBS documentary about Al Davis, the famous Raiders coach and owner. Yeah, that was Tony Wolf that played that role. So that was a big thrill. Thank you, Tony, for stepping in and helping me out there. And thank you to all of you. Honestly, wouldn't be worth doing the show if I didn't have my viewers. I wouldn't be able to do the show if it wasn't for the support of my viewers on both YouTube and Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you can support the show. Helps keep this going. I appreciate it. If not, even things like, subscribe, and comments, or even sharing it with people helps a lot. There's more info. If you found the Marvel method an interesting topic, I focused on quotes from various artists. But there is more information out there, and I'll aim you towards some of that. First of all, there's a Facebook group called The Marvel Method, and they talk about a lot of different things, you know, who created what, the history of Silver Age Marvel, Stan Lee's method, what people had to say about him. But there is some info that is very specifically here and there, like quotes from artists about what they thought of working in that style. I also think that comicbookhistorians.com could be a great source for more Silver Age history, especially articles on Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby. The Kirby Museum, now that I think of it, is also a really good site. And if you want more Jack Kirby stuff specifically, IDW has an artist edition of his work, and you can see a lot of his notes in the margins. Very interesting to actually see how much he shaped a lot of those Marvel stories. And then I'll just wrap up with some plugs. Beyond this show, I do have a second channel called Pros and Cons. And on Pros and Cons, I do a weekly live stream where I recap comic book news, comic book reviews of the past week. Sometimes I have interviews. This coming week, I have Ed Piskor's family on. They're going to talk about what they're doing to publish Ed's last finished book. So that should be really interesting. Also on Pros and Cons, I do a show with my friend Jim Mafood, professional artist. It's called Trash Movie Bonanza. And for Friday the 13th, a couple weeks ago, we of course talked about some Friday the 13th movies. By the way, thank you to Punker Mike for these awesome props for the show. So, thank you all for watching. I've got some more content coming up real soon. That's what we care about, right? Content. Thanks, everybody. Keep reading comics. Bye.